Hi everyone, welcome to my talk about the entangled history of TV technology and TV diversity. My name is Jennifer Armstrong. I have written about television as a journalist and author for about 20 years now. I've covered both the current TV landscape as well as the history, and I've written books about The Mary Tyler Moore Show, Seinfeld, and Sex and the City. I have a book coming out this spring called When Women Invented Television. It is about the little-known contributions of women to the earliest days of television from about 1948 to 1955. And that leads us directly into our topic for today. Every entertainment medium reflects its technology, its delivery system. In music, for example, in the 2000s, as music became more digital, we saw more emphasis on individual songs rather than entire albums, because people could now buy a la carte songs for that 99 cents each back in the day. More recently, with the rise of TikTok and the music being so prevalent on there, you see songs getting shorter, more repetitive, and more memeable. A great example of this is last summer's huge hit, Old Town Road. TV in particular has always reflected its technology and the changes in it. For instance, in the late 90s, early 2000s, as there were more and more cable options available, shows got racier because they wanted to get your attention in this crowded marketplace. So you saw shows like The Sopranos, Sex and the City, and Breaking Bad, among many others. Currently, we have a huge streaming war going on in television, so you see shows that really pivot on suspense. You see shows that have incredible cliffhangers at the end of every single episode that really keep you hitting that button, that next episode button, so you binge as much as you can as fast as possible. TV technology also affects who you see on screen. So diversity in casts has always been closely tied to changes in technology. Today I'm going to take you on a quick tour of TV's 70-year history and show you the ways that diversity has waxed and waned with each big change in technology. And more broadly, this shows us how changes in technology can often affect who is included, who is excluded. And often that's not the intention, and it's not what's on the creators' minds when they make the technology, but the more we can be aware of this, the better off we'll be. But first, before we go on with that, I just want to talk about why this is important. It might be obvious, it might not, but just real quick. Studies show that kids who see positive portrayals of their own race on screen feel better about themselves and feel worse about themselves if they see negative portrayals of their own race on screen. Studies also show that viewers are more empathetic to groups that are unlike themselves when they see nuanced, positive portrayals of those groups on screen. Studies even show that more diverse shows have higher ratings. Still, it's really historically been a struggle to get TV executives to break out of just centering stories on characters who are white, male, cisgendered, hetero, able-bodied, often exactly like those executives who are in charge. So with that, we'll go on to our historical tour. It might be surprising for you to learn that in TV's very earliest days, it was actually quite diverse. This is not because of the times, it's because of the technology. TV in the 1930s and 40s was just not prevalent. Only a very small number of early adopters had televisions in America at that time. There are a number of reasons for this. First of all, you can see from this slide, they are kind of weird at this time. This is only one kind of weird that they were. They hadn't quite just mastered the technology here overall. And they were really expensive despite that. So they were, in 1940, about $400 to $600, which is $5,000 to $7,000 in today's terms. So it was really the true Wild West in terms of content. Anything went because so few people were watching. One of the first shows ever was a one-time special called The Ethel Waters Show. This was in 1939, and it starred the Black actress Ethel Waters. It was her with an ensemble cast in a variety format. She is likely the first Black person to appear on television, but very few people saw it. Even her supporting cast was quite diverse. It included 2 other Black women who were named Georgette Harvey and Freddie Washington, and 2 white men, an Italian-American named Joey Fay and a Jewish-American named Philip Loeb. In the next phase of TV history, which is the late 1940s and early 1950s, set ownership began to grow, but it was still really concentrated in the Northeast in America. This was not only because of cost, but also because there was this cable system that allowed broadcasts to happen. It began in the Northeast and only reached as far as St. Louis to the west. The West Coast had its own programming that was local, but the big time stuff came out of New York and could literally only make it to St. Louis. Most broadcasts were live, so start out, in New York, make it as far as St. Louis, but that's it. It's all you could do at the time. There were 4 major networks: ABC, CBS, NBC, and a network called Dumont, which only lasted into the mid-1950s. Each of those had a system of affiliates throughout the country that ran local as well as national programming. You can see from this map of Dumont stations how concentrated they were. Even the most national of programs were aimed at that top right corner of the country for this reason. In this phase, some stars of radio began to jump over to television to try out this weird new thing, see if they could find their place there. Particularly women and people of color really saw opportunity here because the white men were still happy running the golden age of television, or golden age of radio, and television was just finding its footing, and there was a lot of opportunity there, just kind of open land, where someone could really stake a claim, and if they were big enough, could kind of stick in there even after the real gold rush began. So audiences being concentrated in those Northeast cities in particular, this worked out really well because those audiences tended to be more accepting of these kinds of performers, women and people of color. So, for instance, audiences loved a woman named Gertrude Berg, who created, wrote, and starred in and produced a show called The Goldbergs, one of the first family sitcoms on television. It was about a Jewish family. Parents are immigrants, kids are assimilating in the Bronx at this time. Audiences also loved Hazel Scott, who was the first Black person to host a national, or as national as possible at the time, primetime regular series on television. She was a jazz musician and would play music, and people loved her and accepted her at this time on television. In the next phase, TV went truly mainstream and became big business, culminating right around 1955. That cable system that we talked about that strung the country together actually made it all the way to the West in 1951. So now you could broadcast coast to coast. From there, it took a little while, but TV ownership grew, set costs came down, and programming became more viable as a money-making business. To add even more allure, in the mid-50s, color programming became possible. So TV really grew into a full-on craze by 1955. There was even a pop song called "TV is the Thing" this year. Thus, you can imagine what happens next. The white men came over from radio to a large extent and other businesses, invaded the industry, and began to concentrate on making profits. And women, people of color, and really anyone who was not white and Protestant was pushed to the margins. So this is when shows like Dragnet and The Honeymooners were at the top of the charts. TV hosts included Red Skelton, Ed Sullivan, and Jack Benny. One of the few exceptions is that Cuban-American Desi Arnaz was kind of grandfathered in on a show called I Love Lucy, which he starred on with his wife, Lucille Ball. They really staked their claim right at the right time in 1952, and they were able to just hang on. They were so big, and they were kind of among the exceptions to this otherwise quite white and patriarchal television landscape. By the 1960s, TV wanted to be as broad as possible. Huge business now. And the executives tended to interpret this directive as trying to be as white, patriarchal, and silly as possible. There were only 3 networks serving the entire nation now: ABC, CBS, and NBC. And so they really wanted to make sure that they could maximize profits and appeal to the widest range of people possible. Unfortunately, they had a very dim view of the widest range of people. So this led to a network arms race in stockpiling very bubblegum shows like I Dream of Jeannie, Gilligan's Island, Bewitched, Batman, The Beverly Hillbillies. The closest TV came to diversity at this time were shows like The Munsters and The Addams Family, which were at least about eccentric goth families. Still white, but eccentric and goth. In the 1970s, advertisers began to develop technology that measured the finer points of audiences rather than simply those viewership totals that they were always going for in the 60s. The Nielsen ratings company's advancing technology allowed it to measure and track more details about audiences to attract certain kinds of advertisers. It got a little absurd. One NBC memo from 1970, for instance, proudly announced, audiences of 12 returning NBC shows reveal high usage of dry dog food. More importantly, they could also now track quite precisely viewership in terms of race, age, income, location, and level of education. And they could spit out these reports for networks and advertisers. As a result, advertisers began to demand shows that attracted young adults in particular. And that was usually seen as people under 49. People who were under 49 with high incomes who lived in big cities and had college degrees specifically. The idea was that these people would buy more expensive stuff. It's a little bit surprising, but this actually turns out to be quite good for diversity at this time in history. These people tended to want to see modern times reflected in their programming. So we got more female characters who weren't just playing standard housewives. That's when we get the Mary Tyler Moore Show and her, the famously single heroine, Mary Richards. We also get more liberal-leaning, issues-driven shows like All in the Family and Maude, among others. And we get more predominantly Black casts, like those of the Jeffersons and Good Times. Moving on to the 1980s and 90s, this era brought one of TV's most obvious technological jumps, at least as far as viewers were concerned, because it was right in their homes, in their hands. And that is the rise of remotes and simultaneously the rise of cable television. Cable TV offered viewers many more options than they were used to before, beyond those three major broadcast networks. And now viewers could explore all of those options by using the remotes that were suddenly coming with their televisions. Unlike remotes of the past, these were efficient, easy to use, and cordless. So this is where you get channel surfing really coming into play. This opened the door to niche networks serving specific audiences, such as Spanish language Telemundo and BET, Black Entertainment Television. Throughout the 1990s and into the early 2000s, the increased parsing of audience statistics with computers also led to even more targeted marketing, and thus the segregation of the TV market, given all of these cable options that we now had. So new networks would often try to, and did find success with targeting Black audiences. Fox, which was the fourth network at the time, when it was starting, it did this with offerings such as Living Single and In Living Color. And another network came along, UPN, and did the same with Girlfriends and Moesha, among other shows. All of these shows were marketed exclusively to Black audiences, which was different from Black-centric shows of the past, like The Jeffersons, The Cosby Show, and The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. So we got diversity, which at least allowed Black audiences to see themselves reflected in all kinds of different nuanced portrayals on screen. But we didn't get the kind of diversity that built white audiences' empathy for these Black characters, because most white folks rarely saw these shows. And if you're wondering, yes, at the time, diversity mostly meant Black people present. Few other groups were represented significantly on major networks, even on the margins, beyond occasional breakout stars like a Jimmy Smits or Mario Lopez. The late 1990s and early 2000s brought another major shift that built on several technological trends. It was called HBO, mainly, at least at first, but we'll back up and get to that. VCRs and DVD players are huge by this time, and they had really wrecked the original business model of HBO in particular. HBO's main thing before that had been to show you movies that had just come out of theaters, and now you could see them in your home. So HBO had to figure out how to get people to keep paying for their service, even though there were now tons of cable channels doing similar things. So this led to a TV revolution that was almost exclusively at first white, because it was conceived as a way to get wealthy audiences to pay additional money for programming. It was something like the 1970s when networks decided to target sophisticated urban audiences. But this time, Black audiences were completely left out, deemed unnecessary in the marketing equation, probably because this was also the era of such segregated programming in general. The calling cards of this era are the excellent and very white Sex and the City, The Sopranos, and 6 Feet Under. And then later their eventual basic cable descendants like Mad Men and Breaking Bad. The 2010s brought TV's biggest revolution since its invention, which was that Netflix went from sending you DVDs in red envelopes in the mail to building a user-friendly, data-driven video streaming app. This introduced the era of must-watch binging. And you may have noticed, if you are a TV person, nearly infinite choice. It's almost overwhelming. This brings a number of changes in terms of diversity. Streaming has endless space available for shows, with none of traditional TV's limits like schedules, channel lineups, none of it. This also means there is endless space for all types of characters. Netflix and the services that followed, like Hulu, Amazon Prime, etc., don't have to target everyone, which has always been interpreted as white people, with any given show. And that is why Netflix's breakthrough hit was the very diverse, if still pretty white-centric, especially at the beginning, show called Orange is the New Black. Streaming technology allows the services to target their marketing precisely and tell customers about shows that are similar to other shows they've enjoyed. Broad appeal is no longer the goal. And we have returned to the Wild West with the streaming service wars. There are so many options now that there can be a show for anyone and everyone. This has actually led to much riskier choices that allow executives to see with their hard data that sometimes everyone wants a show about new groups with fresh stories to tell. That's what happened with Orange is the New Black and sent us off in that direction. After that, Amazon Prime broke through with Transparent. HBO, now facing lots and lots of competition in prestige television programming, had success with the Black-centric show Insecure, and they marketed it to the entirety of their upscale audience. And since Orange is the New Black, Netflix has succeeded with many series that never would have made it on peak network television. Had shows like Never Have I Ever, which was about an Indian American girl and her immigrant family. Glow, which is about a diverse group of female wrestlers. And Dear White People, which is about a group of Black students at an Ivy League college. So that concludes our tour. It was a whirlwind trip, but now we can see that while changes in technology have no actual agenda of their own, they really can upend the way things have always been done toward inclusion and away again. In TV's case, Hindsight tells us, for instance, that diversity flourishes when there's a low barrier to entry. That is a large number of channels and a risk-tolerant financial model. Basic cable helped bring in more kinds of shows to more people in the 1990s, though that ended up meaning segregated programming. Streaming improved on the model by providing even more options that don't necessarily have to be segregated. The sheer number of options on a Netflix attracts lots of subscribers who add up to lots of subscription fees, and everyone is happy. Netflix thus has more room to experiment with financing all kinds of shows to see what sticks. Another technological feature that fosters diversity in television is discoverability. We see this most clearly in streaming. Your tastes are satisfied by that suggestion engine that keeps telling you things that are like other things that you like. But I think we've all experienced this, especially recently, that some of streaming's greatest delights come from you kind of just browsing around, serendipitously bumping into something that you end up loving. And even some of the promotion itself can often give us stuff that we turn out to really like. This means we can find programming that isn't targeted at us, which also means programming that features people different from ourselves. But the larger point is this. Technological advancements often have effects far beyond their intentions. It's worth noticing with any major leap forward who's being included and who's being left out. Thank you so much for joining me today. You can visit me online for lots more TV history at jenniferkarmstrong.com or on Twitter at jmkarmstrong. Thanks so much.